talk about 4 dangers. And so, on your notes, let's start with why it matters, right? So why do these 4 dangers matter? First of all, they keep us from rest, right? If rest is the abundant life, rest is a life of inner joy, of inner peace, of calmness, of trust, of hope. These get in the way of that, right? And so we're going to see that in the passage here. And I'm going to read it here in just a second. And then the second thing we see is that we fall away. And that's where this author is coming at. So let's go to Hebrews chapter 3, verse 12. And I'm reading again, New American Standard says, "Take care, brethren, that there not be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God." So there's that idea of falls away. So, unbelieving heart that falls away. "But encourage one another day after day, as long as it is still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast to the beginning of our assurance firm until the end. While it is said, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me. For who provoked him?" So now the author is going back to Jewish history. Doesn't really mean as much to us, but he's going to come back in. So he's using this example, not relevant to us, right? You know how several months ago I used the phrase, get off in the broccoli. I mean, how many of you know the phrase, off in the broccoli? Apparently I was the only one. So I used the phrase and like, what? You guys don't know that phrase? Somebody said, what did you mean by that? I'm like, huh? So sometimes apparently you say stuff that doesn't mean something to people, right? Well, the author here is given this Jewish history, which we're like, what? We don't really understand it, right? So we're going to read through it. We decided in the book of Hebrews we're not going to reteach the Jewish history as much, but kind of take the application points. So verse 16, "For who provoked him when they had heard? Indeed, did not all those who came out of Egypt led by Moses? And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest?" Again, the idea of rest, "but to those who were disobedient. So we see that they were not able to enter the rest because of unbelief." Chapter 4. "Therefore, let us fear if, while a promise remains of entering his rest, any of you may seem to come short of it. For indeed, we have had good news preached to us just as they also, but the word they heard did not profit them, because it was not united by faith in those who heard. For we who have believed entered that rest, just as he has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in the passage, thou shalt not enter my rest. Therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and those who had formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience, he again fixes a certain day, today, saying through David, after such a long time, just as he had been said before, today if you hear my voice, do not harden my heart." So again, there's a lot of context here, right? He's going back and saying, God promised the people rest. Moses led them out. They did not enter rest. They all died because God was angry with them. And he mentions they sinned in verse 17. They were disobedient in verse 18. And so, but then later, hundreds of years later, David said, there is a rest. And so the author is going back to say, God had promised rest. They didn't get it. David mentions rest. So there's still that promise of rest. It's still a promise that's out there. For if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that. So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. Verse 11. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter that rest, so that no one will fall. Again, here's our idea of falling. Through following the same example of disobedience. For the word of God is living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword, and piercing as far as the division of soul and spirit, of both joint and marrow, and able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart. And there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are open and laid bare to the eyes of him with whom we have to do. Therefore, since we have such a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Speaking of Jesus, right, that high priest, again, we don't think in those terms, but Jesus Christ came, was tempted exactly the same way we were. He was tempted fully, and yet he did not sin. Verse 16, therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. So, the four dangers, right, one of them is a danger of falling away. And it's mentioned here, we read it in verse 12, take care, not be any unbelieving heart that falls away. And then in chapter 4, verse 11, we read it again, therefore let us be diligent to enter the rest so that no one will fall. It's interesting, right? So that's all the author's trying to tell us, right? To the people and to us. You believed, you've been following, don't fall away from what you believe, right? Hold fast to what you believe, right? And that fall away is interesting. Two different Greek words are both translated fall away. One's kind of a deliberate rebellion. That's the one used in chapter 3. It says, you harden your heart, you deceive, you disobey, and then you purposefully fall away because you just choose to. And then the other one in chapter 4, verse 11, is more of a passive falling away. It's almost, there's this idea in the Greek that if you let go of something, you fall. And so he's saying, don't deliberately walk away from Christ and don't lose grip. Don't lose hold on him so that you then fall away. Either way, purposefully or accidentally, right? Hold fast to Jesus Christ so that we do not fall away. And so that's the fourth danger. Let's talk about the first three dangers that we see in this passage. So, number one is unbelief. 2 is being deceived. And so let's go to chapter 3, verse 12. Take care, brethren, that none of you, that there is not be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. But encourage one another day after day, as long as it's still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. So the first thing he says is unbelief is one of the warnings for us. Then he talks about being deceived, and really it's the deceitfulness of sin, which is internally, right? This is a self-deceit, right? This is not externally be deceived, which is a challenge for us, right? How do we decide between truth and what people say to us? What the author is saying here is that there is a deceitfulness that comes with sin. When we sin, it brings with it a deceitfulness in our internally, right, in our heads. And then the third thing he says is disobedience. And so he goes on, verse 17, and with whom was he angry? Those who sinned. Whom did he swear they would not enter? Those who were disobedient. So those three things, and of course, just because we can, I'm going to change unbelief, right? If we take away unbelief and we just call it disbelief, then we have 3 D's, which of course preachers like that. It's alliterated, right? So we have disbelief, being deceived, and being disobedient. These are the three dangers that the author of Hebrews pulls out for us. Okay? To disbelief, deceived, and disobedience. So let's talk about them a little bit here. So first of all, again, on your notes, they are connected. We might see those as 3 separate things, but what's interesting, verse 17 and 18, which we just read, those who sinned, into verse 18, but to those who are disobedient, then verse 19, so we see that they were not able to enter because of unbelief. Well, the author just said it's because they sinned. It's because they disobeyed. And now he's saying, well, it's because they had disbelief in our term, right? They didn't believe. Unbelief, right? Which is exactly where he starts, that unbelieving heart in verse 12. And so the author is drawing this comparison that disbelief and disobedience goes hand in hand, that they're connected, right? And then the other thing that we see is they are all causes and they are all effects. And really what happens is one thing causes the next thing, and then that thing becomes the cause for the next thing, right? We just get stuck. We would say we get stuck in this spiral, right? We get stuck kind of in this, I would say, a doom loop, right? Where we just, right, one thing leads to another, and so disbelief leads to disobedience, which leads to more disbelief, which leads to more disobedience. Same thing with being deceived, right? Deceived leads to disbelief, which leads to disobedience. So we just get stuck in this vicious cycle. So let me give you a couple other scriptures, and we'll kind of flush this out of how those are connected. So the author says they're connected, but doesn't really explain it. So let me give you, first of all, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. The same author, a couple chapters later, what's called the great chapter of faith, says, without faith it's impossible to believe God. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, or that he exists, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. So what the author later says, you have to believe, right? You have to believe or you're not even going to come to God. You're not even going to follow God. You're not even going to seek God if you don't believe that he exists. Faith is necessary, so disbelief, unbelief, is not going to move us in the direction we should go because we don't have belief. We don't trust God and who he is and what he says, right? Later in that same chapter, 11:25, he says, talking about Moses, goes through this great list of men and women of faith. Moses is one of them. Talks about Moses choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasure of sin. Now, I put that verse up there because sin is pleasurable, right? Sin is enjoyable, right? A lot of times we think it's not, or we want to say it's not, but sin is pleasurable, right? And this passage says that instead of enjoying the pleasure of sin, Moses said, no, I'm not going to do that, and I'm going to follow God, right? And so I think this is one of the, so let's give you a couple examples. So this is one of the things that God's graciousness, in my opinion, God's graciousness works against him, right? So how many of you ever told a lie of any size? Yeah, every hand better be up, right? Come on. I know you probably have, right? Even if it was when you were a little kid, right? You tell a lie, and then what happens is you get away with it, right, for a while. And when you get away with it, what does that do in your little child brain? It says, that worked, right? That worked, right? I didn't get what I was supposed to get. I didn't get the consequences or whatever should happen. And it works, right? Can you imagine how honest we all would be if the first time we lied, God sent a lightning bolt and zapped us in our little 6-year-old brain, right? From then on, you're going to be what? Truthful, right? Because there is no pleasure, there is only punishment. And sometimes the grace of God makes it that we kind of lean against that. Because what we didn't do in our head is we say, well, a little white lie is not that bad. It's not really that big of a deal. And so what has happened is we have deceived ourselves, right? And therefore we disobey. But actually what happens is we disobeyed, so then we deceive ourselves, and then because we've deceived ourselves to say, a little white lie is not so bad, then what happens the next time? We disobey and deceive and disobey, right? So we get in our heads, what happens is these all start to play together, and there's lots of things where we would say, well, it's not really that big of a deal, right? It's not really, it's lots of things, right? I mean, we have lots of things, right? I'm a guy. I have guy issues, right? And one of them is anger, right? Sometimes if you give in to anger feels good, doesn't it, in the moment, right? Anger is very pleasurable. That's why it's a dangerous emotion, right? Because it feels good to just give in to anger, right? But when I do that, then I start to tell myself, well, that person deserved that. Or that person treated me wrong. Or, you know what? Maybe I wasn't really that out of control, right? As soon as I sin, there's a part of my brain that starts to justify my poor behavior, right? And then that part of my brain then starts to spin and say, it's okay, it's not a big deal. whatever it might be, right? And we start to, and then what happens is that opens up the avenue to more anger or more lust or more whatever it should be, right? That we struggle with. So it's interesting. Let me give you one more verse and then we'll. James 1:22. But prove yourselves doers of the word and not merely hearers who delude themselves. What James says, completely different author, he says what happens is if you hear what you're supposed to do and you don't do it, you have deceived yourself, right? So we're back to our deceit and disobedience, right? So those come into play and they affect one another, right? Because what we do is we say, well, when Adam and Eve were tempted, what Satan did was he came in and said, did God really say, right? And because casting unbelief so that there would then be disobedience, right? Did God really say? And that's one thing I think that Satan still does today, right? Did God really say, right? Did God really say that sex is only for marriage, right? Did God really say that lust is an issue, right? Did God really say sex before marriage, right? We say, well, it's not really that big a deal, and Scripture's kind of outdated, right? Does God really say, today in our society, does God really say that marriage is a man and a woman? We say, well, what's a big deal if they love each other? That's a problem, right? Because God really did say those things. And you can't, what happens is if we start to question them, we're really starting to have unbelief or disbelief about the nature and character of God, because we start to say, is God really a good God? Maybe God's trying to limit me from the important things. Does God really know what he's talking about? Because I think he says this, and I think this is the better course, right? Getting ready, of course, it's January, so I don't know if it's on your brain yet, but starting to think taxes, right? So getting stuff together, thinking of taxes for January, right? Does it really matter, right, if I cheat on my taxes because government, really, they don't do stuff they're supposed to do, so why do I really have to be honest, right? But what happens is we get this unbelief about God's ways being right, God's will being right, because we start to question either the goodness of God, that he's hampering us, he's limiting us, or we start to question the wisdom of God, that God doesn't know what he's talking about, or maybe the power of God. Sometimes we have stories in the Bible where Abraham is supposed to have offspring with Sarah. He got impatient, and he's like, I don't know if God's plan's really going to work, so I'm going to take things into my own hands, right? And we sometimes do that, right? Sometimes we think that God's work in other people is too slow, and so we manipulate, and we twist arms, and we guilt, and whatever it is our skills are, right, to get what we want. So those three things, disbelief, being deceived, disobedience, they just come hand in hand, and they feed in off of each other. We just get in this vicious round and round cycle, right, where and it's interesting, some people say, does the unbelief come before disobedience, or does the disobedience come before being deceived? It's like the chicken and the egg, right? You can spin them around forever, because the author is saying they just all come in together, right? So next week, we're going to look at action items, kind of what the author tells us to do. Today, we're just talking about how these are related. There is some other news. We want to kind of put the good news out there. There is mercy, and there is grace for help. Chapter 4. Many people think verses 14 through 16 are kind of transition from the one thought to the new thought. But in verse 16, the latter part of it, let us draw near with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in times of need. And so the author's awesome at this, because he knows we all have parts of God that we believe, and there's parts we don't believe. We believe the truth in many things, but we let ourselves be lied to in some things. And so the author says there is mercy for you. There's mercy. You're going to get it wrong. You're going to mess up. But Jesus went to the cross to give us mercy, to forgive us. We don't get the punishment we should deserve. And so he says there is mercy. And the second thing he says, there is grace to help in time of need. So those two things, right? What a beautiful verse, 16, right? Draw near so we may receive mercy because we do get it wrong. We do disobey. We may want to not do it. We should, it says, be diligent, let us fear. We should be moving forward, but we're going to mess up, right? There's mercy, but then also there's grace to help, so that as we move forward, God's power in us. So let me give you this. I don't know. I've been trying to think of, next week we're going to talk about action items, and there's several let us, therefore do this, and this, and this, and this. And it's kind of separating those from today. But I want to kind of give you a couple things to take away. So, and they're on your notes, but if you don't have notes in front of you, I have a visual. Let's skip my visual. Let's go right here. Let me give you questions to ask yourself. In what ways is my lack of rest caused by the three dangers? So, disbelief, deceived, disobedience. So, if Christ came to give us abundant life, if that abundant life is a life full of joy and peace and love and patience, in those moments when you're not patient, here's what I want you to do. Say, okay, obviously I don't have a heart at rest. Why? Is there something I'm not believing? Do I don't believe God's got this? Do I don't believe that he's good? Do I not believe that he's taking care of me? Or how have I deceived myself in my head? Do I feel like the only way I could be happy is if I get this outcome? So I'm pushing for this outcome because that's the only way I can be happy. So the next time you have a lack of rest, I want you to just kind of think through and say, is it because, now the author of Hebrews doesn't say these are the only three dangers in the society, right? But he says these are three of them. These are three dangers that produce a lack of rest. So the next time you're experiencing a lack of rest, I want you to just say, maybe, what way is this related to those three dangers? Does that make sense? You got that? What are the three dangers? Somebody give me one of them. Huh? Disbelief, disobedience, and deceived, right? Being deceived. So the next time you're struggling internally, I want you to ask yourselves. Here's the next question, which I felt led to put in there, but it's a tough question, right? Here's your question. Does anyone know me well enough to know about these four dangers in my life? Does anybody know me well enough to know how I'm doing? Because, we come to church on Sundays, and you might talk to some people other times, but you come to church, and you're like, how you doing? And the answer is, fine. How are you doing? And the answer is, fine, right? Unfortunately, the way we do church is a very surface level, very surfacey level, right? And so people could be drifting, falling away. You could be very self-deceived. You could be living a life of disobedience, but you come and you put on a happy face and you say, I'm here at church and life is great. Is there anybody who knows you well enough to know how you're doing in these four dangers? And knows you well enough to have the courage to ask you. Does that make sense? Because there might be people who know well enough, but the relationship is just not deep enough for them to feel comfortable saying, hey, this seems off. This seems amiss. They notice it, but there's not that relationship where they feel comfortable asking. I think that's what we need to be as a body, right? To be connected enough that people notice when we're starting to drift as the author of Hebrews is talking about. Now that's a scary, difficult thing. As we said before, our society is all about isolating us, right? And creating a virtual world that we then think we're connected, but we're not really connected, right? So I just write down those two questions or take your notes. I just want you to think about those. One, when the situations happen, and the other is just a deeply disturbing reflection question, right? And of course, it doesn't say, are you willing to listen to anybody? I suppose that's the other side of that question. All right, let's pray. Father God, I just thank you for who you are. Thank you for your love, your care. Thank you today as we just sang about how beautiful, how magnificent and amazing you are, and your love for us and plan for us. Thank you again for sending Jesus. Father, I just pray that we would take these three ideas, disbelief, deceived, and disobedience, and we would just ponder them, how they're connected in our lives, in the things that we struggle with. As the author of Hebrews later calls besetting sins. And we would renew our commitment to hold fast, to stay firm, and to be grounded in you. In your Son's name we pray.